Good afternoon, everyone. Hi, and welcome to the second annual Wild Wisconsin Winter Web Conference. Whether you are just joining in now or have listened to some excellent sessions that we've had so far, we're glad you're here today. I'm Jamie Machik from the Nicolay Federated Library System in Green Bay, Wisconsin. So my system, along with 13 others in Wisconsin, are bringing you this conference virtually, and we do hope you enjoy it. So our next presentation is called Library Metrics and Measurement, Counting What Counts and Making It Matter, by Emily Clasper. And Emily is the System Operations and Training Manager from the Suffolk Cooperative Library System in Bellport, New York. So Emily has had some trouble logging in. Something just went kaput on their end. She's out in New York. So she dialed in by phone. I have a copy of her slides on my end. So if you hear her saying next, it means she's telling me to advance her slides. So we apologize for that, but hey, we want to make this work any way we can. So Emily, whenever you're ready, go right ahead.
Oh, great. Yeah, never a dull moment in technology world, right?
No.
Yeah, so like Jamie said, I'm Emily Clasper. I'm from Suffolk Cooperative Library System in out in New York. We're the east end of Long Island, so sticking out into the ocean east of New York City. Some of you probably didn't know there was an east of New York City. But we have 54 public libraries in our county, and the Cooperative Library System serves all 54 of them with various different services. And we have a population of just over 1.7 million at this point. So it's a pretty large population that we are serving through these 54 public libraries. And what I do there is my department runs the shared ILS for 49 of those libraries. But then in addition, we work with them in training and professional development, and basically we wear a lot of hats, as many of us in libraries world do, and just try to help them do what they do even better. They already do it well, and we just try to help them get to that next level. So it's a lot of fun, and there are a lot of challenges. And one of the challenges that has been coming up, I would say more and more, I've been at Suffolk for 9 years now, and in basically this capacity. And more, maybe over the last year, 2 years or so, what we've really seen come up more is a lot more questions about metrics and measurement and statistics, and what are we going to do with this? So let's move to the next slide. Okay, so today's big question is that we're going to talk mostly about measuring success. And like I said, this is something that has come up more and more over the last couple of years, that we've got this really big question about how can we reflect what it is that we're doing right. We do a lot of things right. And, excuse me, so if you move to the next slide, most of the time how we try to do this is by relying a lot on our library statistics. It's all about the stats, right? We rely on it for so many different things. Next slide. So our library statistics usually, and this is just from my own experience with all these public libraries, is that usually that consists of the circulation transactions, the door count, all of these things that you see here, right down to collection inventory, program attendance, things like that. These days it also includes traffic on your website, web analytics, followers in social media, interactions through social media, and so on. These are all the things that we've really figured out how to count. We haven't necessarily, though, figured out exactly what to do with all those measures. And one thing that I've run into a lot lately is the next slide, the panicked call. We have been getting a lot of calls over the last few years from library directors and library staff saying, hey, we know we're doing great things. We get great feedback. We see people come in our doors. We see these, our materials moving. We know, even if it's anecdotally, they know that they're doing well, but their stats are down. The things that they've always counted are not reflecting what they know to be a success. And this has become a call that I get really, really often. How can our circs be down? We're doing really well. And I believe them. I know that they're doing very well. Next slide. It's so important that we get this right because the libraries are really depend on the numbers that they're getting. They're depending on statistics and metrics to do so much. I know you probably have all dealt with this in one way or another. They're looking for funding. If you show a downward trend, all of a sudden, no wonder your phone call is panicked, because is this going to mean that it doesn't secure you the funding that you're looking for? How are you going to convince a library board to take a specific action if the numbers are not going in the direction that you would like to see them go in, or that you feel like they might be going in? How do you demonstrate your value to your community and so on? So you get a lot of folks who are very, very understandably panicked when what they know to be true in one way is not necessarily reflected in the numbers that they're relying on for all of these different reasons. They also have a hard time making good informed decisions within the administration of the library because they may not actually be getting good data or analyzing it in a way that can help them make some data-driven decisions in terms of allocating their resources, doing staff and service development, and so on. So it's really, really, this is something that's really, really important as funds are stretched even tighter and resources are spread really thin. A lot of libraries, what I see, if we go to the next slide, and think about it if this is you. It's great to depend a lot on circ stats, but one thing that I think is really a big problem that we need to think about is how much can we really tell about our libraries and the successes that we have by only looking at circ stats. I do know that a lot of libraries do more than this, but I also know that a lot of libraries, their primary method of justifying expenses and securing funds and showing successes depends so heavily on circ stats. And that can really be an issue, especially in a day and age when at least some of our libraries, they see over 50% of their circs come from DVDs and CDs. And that makes me a little nervous that they're relying on those numbers so heavily when simultaneously DVDs and CDs are, to some accounts, on their way out. Certainly, we've seen over the last few years in our system, we've seen those numbers start to drop. So as these get closer and closer to going down, and they make up such a big part of what we rely on in our statistics, it makes me really nervous that so many libraries would rely so heavily on those to make their case effectively. So where do we go from here? One thing that I've been working with some of our libraries with is finding a new starting point for some of the metrics and the measurements that they're taking. I think there's a real danger, especially with libraries, librarians, and administrators who don't necessarily have a background in using numbers and statistics and metrics. That's something that kind of gets, usually in library world, kind of learned on the side. Maybe you have one class in library school, maybe you've taken professional development in it, when really this kind of stuff you can get whole advanced degrees in. You can, go on and specialize and really delve into these things. You have specialized professionals who do this work, and we're trying to do it with not much real background in it. So right from the outset, a lot of times what I see when I work with our libraries is that they start out by asking the wrong questions, and we need to steer them towards the right questions. So the next slide, it should say the wrong question at the top. I just want to make sure that we're all synced up here.
Yep, we're good.
So, okay, we're good? All right, sorry. So the next, the thing that we need to make sure is that you're asking the right questions before you even start going about looking at statistics, deciding what to measure, anything like that. So here's an actual question that I got from a library that I was actually consulting with a few months ago. They were looking at all of their statistics and measurements and looking at the kinds of things that they wanted to measure. And this sentence actually came out of someone's mouth. They said, we bought a 3D printer and it gets a lot of use, but our circulation is down. And they were really, really puzzled by that. Now, I love libraries and I love the folks who work in libraries. There's nobody better. But sometimes I have to be like, oh dear, did you hear what you just said? This is like, to me, one of those like apples and oranges situations. If you move to the next slide, it's kind of like saying, wow, you've got a long jumper here who, she's a really strong athlete, but she doesn't run very fast. You know what? Who cares if she runs very fast if she can jump long? And so we are getting questions that come through to us at the organization I work for and that I hear independently of that, where folks are trying to use particularly circulation stats and measurements that they've used for a long time in order to answer a question that doesn't fit. They're not asking the right question, and they're not using the right data to try and answer that question. So one exercise that I know I've used a few times with libraries and staff in libraries is to talk about what we can do to ask new questions. Okay, if we move to the next slide. Okay, and this one's got a couple of things, so you might want to, oh, let's see, you can see it because it's a PDF, right? Okay, so when we're talking about asking new questions, there are 5 things that I like to ask myself when I'm helping a library look at what kind of questions to ask of their data. The first and most important thing is to ask whether or not they're looking for something that has an answer. There are questions that you can ask that you just can't answer and you can't measure. The next thing is basically looking for knowledge. Well, is this a question that we're asking of ourselves that actually matters for anything? Is this going to actually contribute to the knowledge that we have about how our services are doing, what areas that we can lead to, and so on? And sometimes it's not. It's like, wow, why would we even ask that question? Moving on. We try to focus a lot on, this actually goes with the next question that we look at. Does this knowledge help us assess our progress? We are usually trying to grow. We're trying to move our services in a particular direction towards a particular goal, which we'll get to in a second. And does answering the question, does it bring us knowledge that will help us in that? Going along with that, can it be used and is it actionable? Is it something that if we ask this question, if we get the answer, can we do something with that? And again, sometimes the answer is no. It's nice to know, but there's nothing you can really do with it. And then the biggest thing that everything needs to come back to, and I'll talk about this for a minute, is whether or not the questions we're asking and the measurements we're taking, the analysis we do, whether or not all of this actually is going to help lead us closer to our goals as an organization. So move to the next slide, and let's talk about our goals for a second. I am a big strategic planning nerd. I know it's really boring and dry, and a lot of folks see going through the steps of formal strategic planning and so on as being kind of a waste of time. They want to get to the action. I actually find that it's really, really helpful to go through all those steps because then you have a systematic approach to you don't miss anything, you don't skip any steps, and that's just the way that I operate. So just keep that in mind as we go through some of this, is that for me and the way that I operate and help the libraries that I work with, this really works. So the main thing is that you must always, always, when you're deciding how to measure and what statistics to use and what questions to ask, you have to focus absolutely everything back to your initial goals. If you don't know why you are doing something, then there is no point in proving that you do it well, and you can't even prove that you're doing it well. What does it mean to be successful in this? Well, to find that out, you have to look at what your goals are and really make sure that they are both clearly identified in any service and any action that you're doing, and that those goals lead back to furthering the mission of your organization. It seems like common sense. All of this is. It really is when you lay it out like that. But, excuse me. So the really starting with what the goals of a particular service are, making sure that those are clearly well-defined and identified is absolutely essential for moving forward and learning what questions you need answered, and then putting together an assessment situation where you can actually get something useful out of it. So move to the next slide, and let's talk for just a second about the difference between outputs and outcomes. I hope everybody has heard of these terms. Usually when you look at the literature in measurement and metrics, there's a lot of talk that goes into outputs, outcomes, and then also inputs, which I don't talk about too much in this presentation today, but is also part of the equation. So when you look at the goals that you have very clearly spelled out, according to the last thing that we were talking about, once you have your goals really clearly spelled out, then you can translate that into what you might expect the outputs and the outcomes of a particular service or action to be. So the outputs, the way that I always think of it is the outputs are the things that you've done. You've made 100 cupcakes. That's the result, and that's what we're really, really good at measuring. We checked out 100 books, things like that. That's most of your traditional circulation statistics and so on. The outcomes are a little bit trickier, but I would say even more important. So in this case, our output is that we made 100 cupcakes. The outcome is that we have 100 happy, sugared-up kids. We usually focus on those outputs. They're easy. It's also what our funders usually ask us for. I know the state of New York, we're in January here, we're getting into the swing of our state report preparation period in the state of New York. And this is what the state is asking us for. They're asking us really for a list of outputs. And that's great, and you need them. But if you're really going to have a clear sense of how well your library is meeting its goals and moving towards the success of its mission, then you also need to consider the outcomes really, really closely, and that's really, really hard. If we go to the next slide, this is a little slide that talks about outcomes measurement. This is something that you could do tons and tons of research on. I know I've done a lot of reading on the processes that you can use to do outcomes measurement. I would absolutely recommend the book that I have cited at the bottom of the page here, Demonstrating Results. It's very, very practical in terms of methodologies and pitfalls and the process of outcomes measurement. So if you're looking for a place to get started in understanding that and really applying it within your library, I would absolutely check out that book. It's really great. And this little diagram, I kind of reformatted it to go with these slides. But this really shows what the difference between the inputs, activities, and outputs and the outcomes and goals are. I really like how this little graph just breaks it up into two areas where you're measuring the process, but you're also trying to measure the results of the process. And what I extra like about how this is framed here is that you can also correlate that with the library perspective. What are we doing? And the results really come down to the user experience. and the impact on the user. So this is one way to kind of think of that outcomes measurement. And absolutely, check out that book. There, I have some other resources at the end of the slides here that we can that are really great for kind of getting started in looking at this kind of stuff. Okay, so the next slide says, what defines success? That's a great question, right? We have a lot of questions today and not many answers, I must say. Consider it a food for thought kind of webinar. So when you start really looking at outcomes measurement and coming up with good questions that you can actually answer, it really all comes down to, what are you trying to do? What are we defining as a success? And how do we know when we've got to that goal? It's surprising to me sometimes how many folks I encounter who don't think about this. They put something into place. They put a new service in their library into place, but they haven't taken the step to just sit down and say, we will know this is a success if, and to really say, what is a success in this case? So I can't say that enough. All right, so the next slide, we'll kind of skip through this slide, data collection. Let's talk a little bit. This is something that I wanted to touch on a bit. Like I said, there's so much information that's out there, and this is a whole area of study. It's kind of hard to boil down into a 1 hour, but we're trying. So let's move on to the next slide after data collection that says, what data do we need? All right. So now
Emily?
Yes.
I just have to say that you are sounding so seamless and doing such an awesome job for not having control of the slides. So kudos to you.
Oh, well, thank you. I hope we're keeping in sync.
We are.
Okay, good, because this is kind of hard.
I know, and you're doing great. I just had to tell you that, and I wanted everybody to hear it because it's not an easy thing to do.
Thank you.
And no, you're doing great. So.
Okay. Well, thank you. All right, so let's skip to what data do we need. So now at this point, we've hopefully thought about our goals a little bit, the kind of questions we answer, what it is we're actually looking for, and now we got to decide what it is we're going to try and measure. And I want to talk on the next slide, it says key performance indicators, about key performance indicators. Hopefully this is something that if you haven't heard of, or haven't looked into, you don't know what that is, definitely look into this a little bit. I think this is a very successful, and at least in my experience, approach to making sure that you're getting the data that you need to answer those questions. I see it all goes backwards, to answer those questions that come from your goals and so on. So I've got two things on this slide. One is that I actually just tweeted yesterday. I just threw something out there, and I do this a lot. I just throw a question out onto Twitter, and I see what answers I get. And the question I asked was, in 140 characters, what are key performance indicators? And I got a couple of answers, but this is my favorite one. Came from Paul Smith. In our world, a defined and measurable activity that moves the needle towards hitting a strategic goal. I thought that was a real concise explanation of what a key performance indicator is. To expand on that a little bit, there are 5 different things when I'm helping people to kind of come up with what their indicators might be. There's 5 different things that I've gotten out of different sources along the way, but that the kind of questions to ask yourself and make sure that you're coming up with something that is going to be useful as a performance indicator. And those are listed down here. You've got to make sure you can actually measure them. Sometimes you come up with things like, oh yeah, it would be, it would really tell us if this is a success if we could, I can't think of one, but do something, find out about, and it's not something you can actually measure. That's really hard. Again, move towards your goals, something you could take action on, and you can measure it frequently and consistently. That's really important, that you keep your measurements really consistent so that you're actually doing it the same way every time, or at least as close as you can. And that you actually include both objective and subjective performance indicators in there. especially in a field like librarianship where a lot of the goals that you may have to do with things that are not necessarily measured objectively. We'll come back to that in a minute too. Okay, the next slide. I just want to mention that when you're coming up with KPIs, they can take a lot of different forms, including the search statistics that that we were talking about before as being good but not the be-all, end-all, and something we need to consider but also move beyond. So a couple of things, circulation statistics, terminal use for computers, facilities use, things like that, workflow efficiency rates if you're looking at the metrics for staff performance, things like that. Also customer satisfaction, feedback and surveys and things like that. So there's a lot of things that you can use as these indicators. I really personally like to use comparative type of statistics. The little yellow chart that's on the screen here, this is actually, I just ran a snapshot of our library system's ILS, and over the course of the month of December, what were the transaction amounts for each hour. And so you see kind of like a nice little flow there with a peak in the middle of the night when a lot of like automatic processes run. But you kind of can see there comparatively the number of transactions broken down by hours, and that kind of comparative stuff can be really, really useful when you've got KPIs that you're trying to come together. All right, once you've got some of these things, it's a really good exercise to put them down. Express those as strategic goals in a sentence. So here's a couple of different examples of performance indicators that have been expressed in a sentence. I don't like to read the whole screen. I'll just take the third one. By 2016, the number of children aged 6 through 11 with library cards will increase from whatever it is now to what our goal is going to be, X to Y. So a couple of key things that I'll point out about these is that it's a really good idea to include in these kind of statements a time frame. Really, it doesn't have to be really, really set in stone. If you don't quite make that, that's okay. But what you've got there is it gives you a more defined section, and it gives you a little more definition to what is actually considered a success. If you don't make Y by the beginning of 2016, maybe the end is going to be okay, but you've got some kind of a time frame expressed there. A lot of times there are things that are repeating. So like in the last 20 years, I have each year a minimum of 80% of adults and teens, et cetera, et cetera. So this is something that you would measure on an ongoing basis, and the time frame would be 1 year. So that's something that if you put these in place, then you can actually start to take your measurements and assess progress against the degree of success in reaching each of these KPIs. If you have a pretty good degree, say you have 5 KPIs that you have defined for a new summer reading club program. You've put in 5 things. You've expressed them as strategic goals. If you get 4 out of the 5, then you really have something to show for the progress and the success of that program, especially if that 4th one's pretty close. So this is why going through a process like this can be really, really valuable. A couple of things. I'm just going to zip through the next few slides. We'll go to the next slide, which is qualitative measures. I'm just going to talk about really quickly a few things that just to keep in the back of your mind while you're going through a process like this of determining your KPIs and so on. So the qualitative measures, this is something people ask me all the time is, is this something that you think we should be considering? And I say absolutely. Quality versus quantity is always a big question. I know that qualitative measures are really hard to attain, and they're really hard to hold up next to, the hard numbers. But really, a lot of times they getting to those kind of intangibles of our success and getting into the mood of the folks that are, and the satisfaction and so on of the customers, the staff, the community. It's so important because that really gets to the core of most of our missions. So absolutely think about qualitative measures as much as you can and how they can relate to those quantitative measures. It is really, really dangerous to only go by, the hard numbers, because you don't want to sacrifice quality in the name of, reducing overhead too much or things like that. So absolutely can think about qualitative measures. The next one we'll just say really quickly is just being aware of standards. This is on the next slide. It says standards. So the next, being really aware of standards within the industry, within the community, things that you can apply so that you can actually make comparisons that really are meaningful outside of within your own institution. So look within the community, look within the industry, look within other similar industries and so on for standards that you might be able to apply. If there are customer service standards that are used by a lot of retail outlets, in terms of, response times for customers and things like that, then you want to make sure that you are kind of on par with that, because they have set an expectation of a certain standard of customer service within what is going to overlap with your customer base as well. So you want to make sure that you're kind of, you've set up a measurement system that can actually compare directly to those kind of experiences. The next slide. As a tech person, I would be really remiss if I didn't at least mention open data, but really talking about looking at the kind of data that is actually available. There are so many, and just a growing amount of information and data that's available out there if you know where to look. And as librarians, hopefully we can learn where to look or find out where to look. But data is becoming, open data is really becoming a big deal. And it's something that I think we as an industry really need to think about more in terms of how we can apply it and use it for good rather than evil. But it's there, and how can we access it, and how can we actually integrate it with the data that we have locally and use it to a good advantage for our organizations. That's a whole nother talk. Okay. Next slide, available tools. A lot of times what you're going to measure is actually going to depend a pretty good amount on what kind of tools you have access to. I mean, it would be great if we could just measure anything we wanted, anytime we wanted, but especially with budget constraints and time restraints and things like that, it's hard if you have, what do I have on here? A door counter, a suggestion box, RFID tag. If you have access to some of these things, great. They're all really good measurement tools in their own way. But if it's something that you're simply not going to have access to, then as a measurement tool, then you might have to discount some of the data that you're hoping to get because you're not going to be able to get it. But think about the kind of tools that either are available or that you wish were available. I'm a big believer in thinking about what we can't get that in an ideal world would be on our wish list of things to do, and then seeing if there's a way out there that we can make that happen. I know in our institution there was a lot of questions about integrating GIS technology and doing like map overlays and with district boundaries and so on, and demographic comparisons and so on. And those were not tools that we had. We didn't have tools to measure that stuff. So we're making one. So, that's not always a luxury that you have, and we're doing it through some partnerships and so on. But, it's something that if you don't have the tools, then maybe you want to think about a way that maybe you can do that. If we go to the next slide, talking about available tools, it doesn't always mean that you have to like build it yourself kind of thing. I think it's really important that as different assessment tools become available in different industries, that we're looking at those too. I was just having a conversation the other day with a librarian friend of mine who was talking about using some of the high-tech retail tools that are being used to kind of track customer behaviors, attention, movement, location, response measures, and so on. The kind of thing where, like in this illustration, you see a layout of a retail space, and on the right-hand side, there's a heat map of where most of the attention of the customers goes. So if you start to collect data like that, you could do, in theory, things like, oh, how long does somebody browse this section before they're making a selection? Or, you know, before they check out a book? Or they, how many books do they pull off the shelf before they decide that they've got the one for them? Things like that. And that's really oversimplifying things, but hopefully you get the idea. So this does bring up certain issues with compiling and storing data when you're talking about things like tracking the length of time between visits or borrowing habits or behaviors. I mean, that all brings up really serious privacy issues that I know that as librarians we try to be really protective of and really cognizant of. So that's something that I do want to mention as something that we need to keep in mind as we develop these tools and as we start, you know, borrowing them from other industries. All right, the next slide, questions for data collection. So as you start setting up the actual collection of the data, you know, you've got your questions, you've got your goals, you've got what your KPIs are going to be, you've kind of assessed the kind of data you're going to need to answer those questions. Comes the part where you actually do the measurements, and you do need to kind of take a moment every now and then just to make sure that you're doing that effectively. How can you get closer to you know, making these the data collection methods more accurate and so on. Next page. Use of tools. Actually, I love this data collection tool. We approve of this rest area, yes or no? That's very simple, and it's easy, and it's right at the point of service. So those are three things that it really has going for it. Is it failable? Yes. I mean, somebody could just sit there and press no 500 times, but it's reasonably straightforward and probably pretty appropriate to collecting the data that they need to ask their question. But this is, I just like to bring this up because it really goes along with making sure that the tools that we've selected for doing data collection are appropriate to all the questions in the situation, but also that you know, they get used properly and so on. And then again, if we go to the next slide, the accessing and storing of data, again, I just want to mention that it is a huge, again, a topic for a whole nother talk, but the access and security, protecting patron privacy, anonymizing data, the security measures that we put on any data that we store, drafting privacy policies, and also something that doesn't always get mentioned a lot, but staff training in terms of how we handle data and so on. Those are all really, really important things as you get more and more into gathering information that may reflect on the behaviors and habits and so on of your patrons. And I think as librarians, as an industry, we're pretty aware of that, but it's real easy to get very like caught up in measuring and trying to solve the problems. So just want to bring it up again. Okay, the next slide, analysis and interpretation. So now in theory, we've gone through the steps of doing all these things and collecting the data, and now we actually need to do something with it. So that brings up the whole field of data analysis, which, like I kind of said before, not always a strong point for folks in libraries. Hang on, let let me get back to where I need to be, make sure I'm all synced up with everything. Just give me a second. Make sure I'm not losing my place. Okay, so this is something that I think when it comes to data analysis, if we go to the next slide, it says now that we have the data. This is really an area where most of the questions that come up about this really come down to a question of, do we have the skills in our profession? And sometimes we do, sometimes we don't, but this might be an area that has a lot of room for us as a profession to work on, or to explore, bringing in talent from outside or something like this, because data analysis is not an easy thing. If we go to the next slide, drawing conclusions, there are a lot. This is just to point out a few of the pitfalls that I see a lot of folks that I work with getting into when they try to start analyzing data. One of them is the popularity versus importance continuum here. It is very, very easy in a lot of library settings to correlate the popularity of a service or an item or something with the importance of that item. And it is always good to just keep in mind the overall goals again. When you're looking at things like, wow, 400 people attended our concert on the lawn that we had last summer, and 20 people attended our college search seminar. Well, that's all good and fine, but there's also other measures that need to be applied to that. Gone Girl was the most checked out item in our book, I should say, in our collection last year. Doesn't mean that it was necessarily the most important or had the most impact on anyone. So there is more to it than just the simple number. Also, just talking about causation and correlation, I know that's something that most of us are really familiar with, delineating between the two there. We also need to think about, when we're drawing conclusions, we need to think about expectations of our users, and we need to think about emotional impacts too, especially when we're talking about stuff that's going to make our case and tell our stories as libraries and as institutions. And we also need to look at conclusions about the value of library services as they apply to different groups and as expressed in many different ways, in money, not just money, but time, cognitive benefits, things like that. So there's a lot that goes into drawing conclusions that isn't just look at the number, did it go up? This is why the analysis is really tricky. The next slide, this is an example, I'll just say it really, really quick. This is an example of, this is not a library example, but it's very similar to one that I've seen a couple of times where library folks have presented it to me. They said, oh, look, especially when it comes to like library cards or attendance at programs, things like that, what they'll do is they'll put a cumulative number, and they'll say, look, it's just skyrocketing. And we say, actually, you get about the same number of library card signups every month as you always did. Maybe it went up a tiny bit. But what this really tells me is that, say this instead of bike sharing was, library cards, and the orange line is going up really high, this tells me that you actually should probably go back to your database and get rid of some of the old defunct cards that nobody's using anymore. Get rid of the folks who have passed away. So it's not always the conclusion that that folks come up with first. The next slide, too, we said this before, is just to consider while we're making our conclusions and trying to make decisions based on them, that we're actually using it for good and not evil. And I think this is something that we're really very good at with libraries. But it does merit a reminder that we need to guard privacy, we need to further favorable goals, and that we just guard against personal agendas and so on. And I know that can be hard sometimes. All right. The last thing that I really want to talk about today is one that gets outside of what we usually think about a little bit when it comes to statistics and measurement. A lot of times what I had the experience of is that libraries will collect the data, they'll look at it, they'll make their conclusions and so on, and then they kind of stop. They say, oh, look, this is an action that needs to be taken, and that's great. That's part of what it's for. But we're trying to in this day and age get funding, get community support, have different connections with our community, market ourselves, and so on. And so we really need to look at new ways of actually making the data that we collect matter, having the data itself have an impact on our mission. So this is actually, we're on the Making It Matter slide, or I am. This is actually a little data infographic by Phil Bradley that actually really starts to get at this a little bit.
Emily?
Yes.
Just wanted to let you know we have about 15 minutes left.
Yeah, I see that. I'm almost done.
That's fine.
Okay.
Just wanted to let you know.
We're going to go through these really quickly because there's not a lot to say because a lot of them are very visual. So the next slide here, using and presenting data, this is something that I think especially the presentation of the data that we collect is increasingly important as we try to make our case and tell our story and so on. So, and as this infographic here really implies, data is the new oil. It's really, really valuable. However, I really think it's not so valuable unless you actually do something with it that makes it valuable. So the next slide here, one thing is just to make your data easy to understand. This is actually a little infographic, and I personally like infographics as much as I am, I think, understandably wary of what they can imply about data sometimes. But in a case like this is just your simple, like word cloud kind of thing, where there are numbers that go with this. But it is very easy at a glance to tell what the amount of food consumed in 2010, what the most consumed food was for this. It was chicken. It's very easy to understand without a big explanation and without just having a list of numbers there. And people react to that. That's why you see this so much in commercial marketing. The next slide here, making data relatable. This is, I like this particular graphic because this shows me something that I can relate to. I know how big a soda can is, and I can connect with this because it actually means something real to me. And we are seeing more and more libraries do things like this, like taking their data and translating it into something that can make a real connection with folks who, quite frankly, might love the library but don't spend all their time there. They've got other lives. So making this, the library data relate to something kind of in their real lives. The next slide, making decisions. This is a shot of, this is from the New York Times. This is really new, mapping poverty in America. There are a lot of kind of mapping resources out there these days. I was thumbing through. It was featured on in Wired.com a couple months ago, and I was thumbing through it. It's race and ethnicity mapping and things like that for your population. When you work in a community and you're trying to provide particular services to the community, you can really, I think, take information like this and mash it up with data that you already have. So if you're looking at poverty levels I did get Green Bay, in the Green Bay area, can you mash that up with library card data? Can you use this to look at where you should focus on early literacy campaigns? And then look at later on, how successful were you in reaching target demographics in those areas. So as a decision-making tool, very, very big. The next slide here, making connections. This really, I haven't spoken a lot about web analytics or social media measurements, which is really huge. But in some cases, I find a lot easier because you can, there are a lot of tools out there, and there are a lot of ways to actually connect numbers to experiences through that. But this is a little diagram of, this was the Twitter interactions between people who attended a particular conference. And I just like this because it really illustrates the connections between the attendees and so on. And it really tells a story in and of itself if you start delving deeper into that data a little bit. So making connections is really, really important. It provides context, and it's something that can really help you to make your case when you're dealing with, working within a greater community, especially. The next slide, this is really important. If you can find a way to present your data in a way that actually makes a point and does it very simply and oftentimes visually, that can make a huge difference when you're trying to further your goals within a community and with funders and board members and so on. This is actually, I love this infographic. This is if you what is it, New York City's daily carbon dioxide emissions as represented by 1-ton spheres. So each of those little balls is 1 ton, and it's like up to the top of the Empire State Building there. Wow, that's like, to me, that makes an impact. Again, it makes it relatable and so on. And if you can, find a way to take your data and make it relatable like that, you can really make a point. I actually did a little, I wouldn't even call it an infographic because it was like not that good. But I was trying to communicate to a bunch of heads of circulation a few months ago the amount of things that we're shipping between the libraries. And so I took a graphic of the little bins that our shipping department uses to transport between all of the different libraries in our area. And I just multiplied them just using PowerPoint. I just made this big thing and just to show if there's like 40 items in a bin, then this is how many bins there would be. And I put them all in stacks on there, and they were like, whoa. And it looked actually a lot like this. It was something relatable where the point was, it's a lot. So that was actually pretty impressive to them. That was something that made a point. So the next slide actually goes on with this. This is if any time that you can use your data to make an impression, to get like a visceral reaction from somebody, anytime you could get a whoa out of somebody, then you're making an impression, and you can go towards getting your goals achieved. This is actually not a picture of the one that I did, but there was a situation a few months ago with our shared ILS where we were trying to talk to board members about how complicated the setup was behind the scenes. And they just, it wasn't, sometimes just showing numbers just doesn't get there. And so we did something very similar to this picture right here, where we took all of the elements that went into putting the ILS together in the background, and then we printed them all out on like one of those large format printers, and it took up an entire wall of a meeting room, and the point was taken. So, that's the kind of thing that if you can find a way to translate it like that, you can really tell a story. The next slide, telling a story, oddly enough. I think we really, as an industry, need to focus more on telling the story of our institutions to all of the different stakeholders, to the community, to the funders, to the board members, to the staff. And I really think that we can look at how statistics are used by different companies to do that with their infographics, but also, in other ways with their marketing. I was actually reading, it just as like kind of a quick side note, I was actually reading an article this morning that was warning people that against infographics, because you can take statistics and make different things stand out and so on by the colors you use and the how you stress different things. And I was kind of like, yeah, that's what statistics, that's what we do. That's what statistics do. You know, that's always a danger with statistics, but it's also something that, I don't know, maybe that could be something that if we got a little better at that, we could, you know, further our goals a little more. The next page here, here's a couple of examples promoting a brand of how a brand story is being told with the measurements and the metrics, but the story of the brand is being really told here. And if you look at this, you can actually get kind of like a taste for what each of these brands is all about. The next page here is a couple of quick examples. You can come back to these later on because I'm going to finish up in a second. But some examples of how we do see this coming out in libraries. I don't mean to say that we're not doing it. It's just that I feel like we could do more with that. But these are some really great kind of storytelling using statistics that I found just around the web. All right, the next slide, and we're going to come to the end here. Really, for me, whenever I talk about metrics and statistics and measurement or whatever you want to call this, the bottom line here is really getting to an impact. How can you take what you've got and make it make a difference to further your goals? The next slide. So we need to find ways to go forward with this. We've asked a lot of questions today and brought up some concerns, some things to think about. I don't really know that there are a lot of good answers at this point. I think we're really, as an industry and as a profession, really in the question-asking phase and the experimentation phase. So if we go to the next slide here, questions for libraries, here's a couple more questions that overall, when it comes to the topic of metrics and measurement and reaching our goals and assessment and so on, what are the kinds of things that we need to be thinking about? And here's a couple of questions that maybe you can, put in your back pocket and think about later on about using the metrics and collecting the data and so on. But most of all, if we move to the next couple of slides, the first one here, do we have the skills? I think this is really, really important thing for us to ask. If not, how do we get them? The next slide, do we have the tools? If not, again, what tools need to be developed? Can we engage in partnerships to do this? These are some really core questions. And then the next slide, can we make it matter? The most important and the most difficult question of all. You can get the data, you can analyze it, you can make conclusions, but what do you need to do to turn those numbers into something that really has an impact on your community, on your profession, on your organization? The next slide here, second to last, I promise. This is just a little kind of a very brief bibliography that I know that the slides are available online, so don't try to madly copy things down or anything. But this is a little bit of reading that I would recommend if you're looking for some real specifics, some real things to think about, to look more deeply into the issues, and for some practical advice on there. So come back to this and think about it a little bit. And that would be, if we move to the end, that would be all that I have the energy to say today. All right.
Well, thank you so much, Emily. Unfortunately,
Sure.
our hour is up. We don't really have time to take questions, but Emily's email, is that your email listed there? Or is that just your Twitter link?
That's my website and my Twitter handle, and you can email me at emily@eclasper.com or tweet me or whatever. I'm all over the place. So if you've got questions or you want to, I think of this as kind of a conversation starter. So if you want to discuss, I'm more than up for it.
And your email again was Emily?
Emily@eclasper.com.
Clasper.com. Okay, I will write that in the chat box. All right, Emily,
right.
thank you so much for
thank
being
you.
a good sport and calling in with difficulties. So I'm glad it was still able to work out. Thank you, everybody else, for listening in.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.
A nice turnout. So again, for those of you joining in for our next session, it's our last one today. That's at 4 o'clock with Sarah Houghton on Keep It Simple, Keep It Real. We will talk to you then. If not, have a great rest of your day. And thank you again.